Welcome to Bethany. Today we are celebrating the 29th Sunday of Ordinary Time, Cycle C. Slowly but surely we are looking towards the end of the liturgical year. Still quite a few interesting things are awaiting us in the Sundays to come. Today, obviously, even when you just glimpsed over the readings, you already realize that it has so much to do about prayer. I mean, We've spoken so much about prayer, and still there's so many things that we haven't tapped on, or maybe we still have to rediscover, rehash, undust, so that our prayer life would be constantly improving. So let's look into the readings so that we could see what the readings can do for us this Sunday. So the first reading is coming to us from the book of Exodus, so we are really going back to the beginnings of the Bible, and this time we are looking into the 17th chapter of Exodus. That's the famous story of Israel's fighting against Amalekites. Amalekites were a group of people, semi-nomads. And if you want to look into where they come from, actually originally they are coming from Abraham, and more specifically from Esau. You may remember this very famous or rather infamous story of Jacob and Esau fighting for the blessing of their dying father. So Amalekites are coming from that side of the story, and what is really interesting about that is a very interesting shift that is just about to take place in the psyche of the Jewish people, because, as you know, they were in Egypt. They were persecuted over there after quite a few very interesting adventures. They eventually left Egypt. They walked through the Red Sea. You know what happened to the Egyptians. And then they were walking through the desert for a very, very long time. And when you look at the entirety of all those different examples and events, God that was with them was kind of a fighting God, wasn't he? So whenever they were turning to him, he would be shown as this very strong God, right? That excuse me, that would be defeating their enemies. They would be removing all those obstacles. And what is really going to happen once they move into the promised land, once they settle down, the idea of the fighting God is going to kind of vanish, right? Because we don't have to fight against anyone. And thus the question that is going to come to them, and that probably is a question that may be coming to us, because we don't have to believe in God that is this warrior, so to speak, or general. But in what kind of God do we believe? How do we develop now a new faith in God that is no longer that warrior? Or how do we shift our understanding of who God is? One more thing about this reading from Exodus. Obviously, it's about the raised hands of Moses. Not only it is universally accepted and embraced posture that very often is associated with prayer, right? Especially intercessory prayer. But we also have to kind of notice that it wasn't that strange in the antiquities to conduct battles with raised hands. because those raised hands were not only to pray to God, but they were also, as, for lack of a better term, signals. That's how those who were in charge were communicating with those different groups of soldiers, so that the soldiers would know which way to go, what kind of group to send to the battle, and so on and so forth. So that was also kind of signaling at the same time, and it wasn't only practiced by Israelites, but almost all, if not all, tribes and nations of the antiquities, because that was the easiest to be done, and the simplest actually way of communicating over long distance in a very, very short time. There's one more thing I would like to bring to your attention, because it also has to be said that in the antiquities, when people were praying to God, they were praying to God because they had a purpose. Mostly it was associated with the idea of fertility. What I mean by that is that the most important thing for people was to survive. And food wasn't as readily available to them as it is to us. I mean, let's face it, what is your dilemma, right? When it comes to, let's say, think of dinner for tonight, for this Sunday. What is your dilemma? The dilemma is, okay, what am I going to eat? Is it going to be chicken? Is it going to be a burger? Am I going to go for Thai or Chinese? Am I going to order pizza? That's our dilemma. What? Or what do I do? As we say, what do I feel like eating tonight? For them, it was completely different, whether I'm going to be eating or not. Thus, their attitude about God or gods, so they were asking them, begging them to provide good weather, good crops, and so on and so forth, so that they would be able to simply survive. But at the same time, there were a number of cults, and obviously the religion of the Jews was not one of them, because the cults were looking into different ways how to really make God or gods do things. How can you create some kind of a situation that God would not have a choice, right? That God would be having tied hands and wouldn't have any other options but to give what people wanted to receive. And that was a lot of the efforts on the cold side of the story. Now, Israelites in their faith, or Jews in their faith, were absolutely forbidden even remotely to think in those categories. And many of those rules and regulations that you find in Deuteronomy and in other places are so designed so that they wouldn't even think of that. So that an idea of tying God's hands or making God do something or controlling God would not even be on the radar. That's just the background for the first reading. Now, let's look at a couple of questions that might help you in your own spiritual lives to apply that first reading to you. So, my question is this, because we see Moses with the raised hands and with two helpers on either side, on both sides rather. Do you have a prayerful attitude about things that you do? Right? What I mean by that is sometimes, and you probably know many people, and they are very prayerful about many things. So let's say they pray in the morning, they pray before their meal, they pray before something important is to happen. They just make a sign of a cross, or maybe they don't have to do it in some kind of a explicit way, but they close their eyes and they pray before taking an exam. So how do you go about things that you do or in your life? Or for example, when you take upon a journey, or you get into your car, or you send your kids to school, does it have a prayerful element in it? Or is it just another activity that you do? I mean, in some cultures, and I remember that from my own background, meaning that my parents, when I was younger, they used to bless me when I was leaving home. They would be just simply making a cross on my forehead. Maybe not every day, but when I was leaving for a longer period of time, they would definitely do that. And then later, we would do it to each other. So I would bless them, they would bless me on many different occasions. Almost every time I would be leaving home or they would be going somewhere. And that was absolutely something that I cherish very deeply in myself. Actually, I don't know who coined that phrase, but it's a very interesting phrase. Somebody said, the more you bless your kids, the less you're going to curse them in the future. Something to consider. I mean, blessing doesn't cost you anything. It doesn't feel bad, I hope. So why not to introduce a blessing? I bet you they will cherish that. They will remember that. They would hold it in themselves as long as they live, just as I do in my life, after burying both of my parents quite a few years ago already. Going back to our reading. When it comes to struggles, right, because it was a battle, right, so the struggle, do you feel alone? That you're basically fighting against those issues on your own? And how much, if any, do you rely on God? Really rely on God? I mean, because we say, oh, don't worry, God is in charge. And we kind of take it seriously, not seriously. But how much do we really rely on God, especially when we do not know the future, when we do not know how things are going to unroll with the time? Are you impatient, or are you trying to control the flow of events because you think that it is something that you can do better? Or you really give God the room to navigate, to maneuver your life in a way that will be better? Kind of switching a little bit differently when it comes to this reading. Do you understand that there is this thing called a spiritual battle? Of course, we are always living in times that there are certain wars going on across the globe, but are you aware of a spiritual battle that takes place? That those forces are constantly trying to win over you. And I'm not even going to be asking whether you do anything about it, but because that might be a little bit complicated. But are you aware that there's so much at stake when it comes to your life, right? Well, we are speaking about God who's our Savior, who died for us on the cross. And the point is, he had a reason to do that. Because you and me are so precious, and that's why God was so much interested in sending his son, so that the battle would be won. I know that eventually all of that is going to be won, but in the meantime, the battle still goes on. And if I am aware of that, if I am conscientiously looking at my life, then I can really appreciate what happened on the cross 2,000 years ago. And if I'm not, then it may be another fairy tale that I may repeat to myself more often around the Easter time, but it doesn't really hit anything. It doesn't really change anything in my life. It doesn't really create this situation that I feel like I've had a major surgery. And I don't mean in the physical sense, obviously. Now, let's also switch to a different way of looking at this first reading. When people ask you to pray, do you do that? Or you don't? Or you even say, you're in my prayers. I don't even want to go into my thoughts and prayers are with a particular group of people, because that is just, I'm not going to say. But really, do you pray for people that ask you to pray for? Or you thought that you should pray for because of their, sickness, diagnosis, or whatever it may be happening in their lives, or it's just empty promise. Or let's flip it. Do you ask others to pray for you? Would you feel comfortable doing that? Would it mean anything to you? Or are you waiting for a major event in your life that you're going to be pushed against the wall and then you're going to ask? Again, looking at the story and Moses, Aaron, and Hur on both sides, how easily do you give up on prayer? I know that it's easy for us to pray when we really have a reason, right? When we really have a need for that. But if there is, quote unquote, nothing happening, how easily do you give up on prayer? And it just simply doesn't happen, doesn't occur. So that's the first reading. Moving to the second one, again, we are continuing the second letter of Paul to Timothy. Timothy was a pastor, so obviously his words are not directed to a particular community, but to a particular person. But I think that we can kind of look at this second reading from a much wider perspective and see that he is also meaning ourselves. Hopefully we take it a little bit more personally. And what really stuck with me in the second reading is that one statement that all scripture is inspired by God. And don't forget, he first and foremost, he really thinks of what we call the Old Testament. Because the New Testament hasn't been created just yet. It's going to take, another 150 years until that's going to happen. But in the meantime, we are only, or they were only aware of those books of the Jews, right? So obviously, I'm going to be asking some cliche questions, but maybe there are questions that need to be asked sometimes. So let's begin with this most obvious one. So how often do you read Bible? Let's get a little bit more concrete about that. Do you have a favorite quote in the Bible? What is that? And why? Is it this one? Or if you don't have, would you like to look for something that would be your favorite quote in the Bible? Or maybe if you were to accept my challenge or maybe a suggestion, maybe you could, and that can be based on the Sunday readings or readings from any day of the week. Maybe would you like to pick, let's say, one line, one quote for a week, and to kind of begin every day with this quote, right? Recalling that quote. So if I were to use that, right? All Scripture is inspired by God. Okay. And I start my day with that. Obviously, that's not as inspiring, or maybe it is. Maybe it might be to some people. But if you kind of create, in a way, the mantra out of this, then that quote becomes more meaningful, and you're working this quote in you spiritually, then becomes part of your life. And I think it's beautiful, and that's a prayer too. If we were to adhere ourselves to the theme of the Sunday, right? Or maybe let's just look at something else. Do you use devotionals or other? There's so many sources these days. Also blogs. Well, I don't know how many people read blogs these days, but podcasts and so many different other sources that are inspiration. Even on YouTube, I'm finding so many sources on YouTube. When it comes to biblical studies, something that is specific, something that is really interesting, or maybe some apps that help you to pray on a daily basis. I don't know how much time you spend every day commuting to work. What are you doing when you're commuting? You're listening to the radio, or listening to music, or you're just thinking about something. Maybe you can inspire yourself or enrich yourself. Or let's call it differently. Maybe you can pray by listening to something that would really mean something and really enrich you in so many different ways. So that's just another example / suggestion for you. Do you feel like one who belongs to God may be competent, equipped for every good work? And how are you assured about that? Right? So if you belong to God, if you think this way, if you are convinced about that, then you know that God already gave you everything that you need. That you have it in your closet. That you have those gifts in you, without even sometimes being aware of that. Or why don't you feel that God gave you everything that you need? Why do you think that you need more? Right? Even going back for a second to the first reading, for Moses it was enough to raise his hands. Or on another occasion, when they were thirsty, God said to Moses, hey, do something about it. And said, what? And he says, what do you have in your hand? In your hand? And he says, well, my staff. Well, then do something. Hit the rock with your staff. Right? Then he hit the rock, and there was water flowing out of this. You see, sometimes we don't believe that what we have in our disposal is already a solution, because we think on our own, but we are not trying to get God's mind into ourselves. I don't know about this one. Find a way to proclaim the word of God. And you might be thinking, so what do you want me to do? Preach? You go outside of my house, open the Bible and talk to people and say, hey, repent because God is coming. No, I don't mean that. I mean it in a more subtle way. Here's what I'm thinking about. I'm gonna give you an example of that. So, for example, when you are with someone, doesn't matter who that is, and you're going your way, you're parting your ways, you are to leave the presence of the other person, right? I don't know how you say ciao ciao, you say goodbye, take care, see you tomorrow, or whatever, right? The expression might be. Would you consider changing that into God bless you? Hey, that doesn't take much, right? But it definitely has a different context. I mean, even if that person is of a different faith, I don't think that would be taken as a insult, because you're, no matter who that person is, you are wishing that person well. And this is just one example, but think of that. How can you incorporate in your day-to-day activities, in your ordinary ways of relating to people, just to add, as I sometimes call it, like those little chips, the chocolate chips into the cookie, right? Just here's something, there's something. Not that you have to really, I don't know, have this idea that I need to convert you, and it's only a matter of time before you're going to be converted, because maybe we need to be converted ourselves first. But maybe the subtle, very very intelligent way of bringing God to it might actually go a long way. Why not? Hey, at least you can say, this is how I preach the gospel. At least you will have something concrete to say that you're doing. And finally, there's this statement in the second reading: you preach when it's convenient and inconvenient. Here's my question: do you think that it's always inconvenient to preach the gospel? And why is this inconveniency coming? Or rather, what does it make it so inconvenient? Or is it really inconvenient, or we are making this inconvenient to ourselves? And I just gave you this idea about God bless you, right? When saying goodbye to someone else. Would that be inconvenient? Or something of that nature? Think about it. In the meantime, let's move to the gospel. Now we switch to the 18th chapter of Luke, and we have this very interesting story of two people, a judge, not a lawyer, but a judge and a widow. And it seems to be quite contrasting, right? Because judges, obviously, just like nowadays, they had pretty good lives. And they did not really need much because they had enough. They had all the connections. They had a good lives, basically. Very secure, very comfortable. And a widow that would be on the completely opposite side of that story, because she had nobody to take care of her, so she was very vulnerable. So that widow comes to a judge, and in the Old Testament, judges were considered to kind of reflect who God is. In other words, they were to reflect the judgment of God, especially when it comes to the most vulnerable in the society. And now look what's happening. So this widow comes to him, and it says in the gospel that he doesn't care. He doesn't consider God. He's not concerned about any of that, right? The conviction was that if he does not act the way that God would, then he's going to pay the price after his death. But he really doesn't care. He's about something completely different. So you can imagine, without even going to other parts and bits of that this judge is completely corrupt to the core of his existence. That maybe he doesn't care of other people. He doesn't care about the politics of all of that, and he's involved in all sorts of different shenanigans. But at the deepest levels of his existence, he does not care about God. He doesn't care. He just does what he wants. That's interesting. Now, it might be actually quite, what's the word I'm looking for? Appealing that the gospel story is focused on the idea of receiving, right? Because she keeps asking and asking and asking, and that corrupt judge finally says, well, I want to be done with that woman because she keeps bothering me. I just want to be bothered anymore. I'm just going to render a good judgment against whoever wants most likely a payment, and probably she has some land that she inherited from her late husband, and now they're pressing upon her to sell it and pay the debts that she has. So that would be probably the most probable cause for that. So he says, well, I'm going to finally do something good for her because she keeps bothering me. But I don't think it's about receiving, although it may suggest it so strongly in today's gospel, because look at how the gospel ends. The end of the gospel is not said, well, keep praying, and then finally, eventually, you're going to receive. If you're going to keep bothering God, God is finally going to say, well, I want to be done with this guy or this girl, and don't bother me anymore. No. It ends completely differently. It says, will he find faith on earth? So it is about the attitude, right? What is the disposition when I pray? And thus it brings me to questions. Actually, before I even get there, one kind of observation, because it says in the second part of the gospel, how much more the Heavenly Father, how much more, which is a very popular ancient way of writing or stating certain things as a contrast. Actually, contrasting was quite popular. And when I read that, immediately came to my mind the song that you might be familiar with as well, the Gyra by Elevation Worship, right? And it says towards the end of the song, right, if he dresses the lilies with beauty and splendor, how much more will he clothe you, right? And then the second part says, if you watched over every sparrow, how much more does he love you? Actually, just yesterday, actually on Friday, there was a gospel, right, about the worth of a sparrow. We are worth more than sparrows. And right before the mass that I said in the morning, we had a bird in the church. But interestingly enough, that bird wasn't even flying. He was just walking through the church, walking as if nothing, and eventually we opened the door, and we thought that there was something wrong with the bird, that he couldn't fly, that something was wrong with one of his wings. We opened the door, and he crossed the threshold, and he's flown away, right? And then the gospel about how much more are we worth? And it wasn't a sparrow, but still, it was quite hilarious, or rather quite telling. Anyway, let's go back to our story. So a couple of questions. Some of them might be a little bit clichéing, but still I'm going to ask you. So do you pray because you feel that you have to, or you have a business to pray? And you have to explain it to God, because God wouldn't know, would he? What you're dealing with. Or maybe, when do you pray? What makes you to pray? When is it? Is it like something that you do regularly? Or once in a very blue moon? Or maybe on Sundays? Or maybe when you have a day off? When do you pray? Maybe it's in the morning. Maybe it's in the evening. Maybe it's before the dinner. When do you pray? And how? How do you pray? Is it the formulas that you've learned, or is it just a meditation or reflection, or you're reading the Bible, or it's spontaneously done? How do you pray? Now, let's switch our seats. I know. If you were God, would you see the way you pray as a good way, as a genuine way of praying, or not? And why? What would be wrong about it, or what would be good about that? Or I know I'm playing with you, right? If God told you what and how many prayers you have to say in order to obtain what you're asking for, would you do that? Or would you not? And why? Again, if God told you, hey, you're asking me, I don't know, for health, so pray, I don't know, that many Our Fathers or Hail Marys or rosaries, and once you do that, that's going to be given to you. Would you do that? And why? Now, switching a little bit from the prayerful context to a context of interactions with our brothers and sisters, since it describes a judge and a widow. How do you feel when you are to ask anyone? Do you feel comfortable? Do you feel belittled? Can you do it genuinely? Or you're really having a hard time because you have to humble yourself? And why is it happening? What's your problem if that's what's happening in you? Why can't you just ask? Right? And how do you respond to others when they ask you for something? Are you trying to dismiss it? Or it depends on the request? Or maybe it depends on who that is. That you treat differently people that you like. You definitely treat differently people that you dislike. Or how about strangers or people that you don't know very well? How do you take requests? Do you take it as an insult on you or an attack on you? Or an opportunity? Or are you actually happy that sometimes people ask you for something? In any event, these are my proposals. These are a number of questions about the 29th Sunday of Ordinary Time readings, Cycle C. I wish you, as always, a very blessed Sunday and blessed week. And come join us at Bethany next Sunday. We'll be there with next Sunday's readings.